one of the things I learned up there was NEB, now CER, really had worked hard to try to involve landowners. They went through a whole landowner initiative, and they went through an Indigenous Communities thing, and really have kind of got out ahead of what I've seen in the US as far as Indigenous engagement goes. So we're really happy to have 4 people that have been right in the midst of this from the get-go. And I'll just introduce them briefly. Let's see if this thing is going to work. No. There we go. Now it's going to work too well. First is Mark Pause, who's the acting Vice President for Field Operations for the Canadian Energy Regulator. Mark's going to do a little overview. Do you want to do your land acknowledgement now too?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, so just on behalf of the CER, Mark and I are both from Calgary, Alberta, where we left yesterday. It was -25, so we found it funny when we saw poofy jackets here at the airport, but very glad to be here. But we do want to acknowledge where we're from, Calgary, that in the spirit and respect and honor, we acknowledge the territories and people of Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. So that includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda. And it's also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta region 3. And I know this morning a gentleman acknowledged the communities that also called New Orleans home, and I believe it was over 20 communities too. So I want to acknowledge that as well.
Great. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark, and he's going to walk through some initial slides, and I'll give you the little clicker. You can either come up to the podium or you can do it from there. I don't care either place. Might be easier here.
All right, thank you. Perfect. So I'll just give you a little bit of background on the Canadian Energy Regulator. And in Canada, we regulate the interprovincial and international power line and interprovincial energy pipeline, so oil and gas. Like mentioned, the CR is the successor of the National Energy Board, which was founded in 1959. Oops, it's moving on its own now. Back. Hopefully this is not a timing thing. Okay, stop here. Yes, it is on some sort of timing.
Oh.
Okay. Hopefully we'll stay here for a bit. So yeah, it was founded in 1959 and it changed over in 2019. And the new mandate includes a commitment to reconciliation with Indigenous people. Overall, 73,000 kilometers of pipeline, 1,400 kilometers of power line. We have a staff of about 500 in 4 offices, mainly in Calgary, and then we got one in Montreal, Vancouver, and Yellowknife. We regulate about 100 companies, and some of the major ones are Nova Gas Transmission, or TC Energy, Trans Mountain Pipeline, and Enbridge Pipelines. We are a life cycle regulator, so from the application all the way to abandonment, including construction and operation. We have environmental protection. In terms of disciplines, we have environmental protection, safety management, emergency management, security, damage prevention, integrity management, and also socioeconomics. All right. I'm going to talk a little bit about Indigenous monitoring, and I want to talk about 3 different categories that we see in that sense from our perspective. The companies that we regulate usually have an Indigenous monitoring program, and they've been existing for a while, and they use their own. Is it still moving forward? Yes. Can we go back? I'm not sure if
it's moving on its own.
Okay. Nope. This is really fun.
We can plug, I think we can plug the computer, maybe not. I thought they were going to run the computer up here.
Okay, I think it might be on a,
Yeah, I was about to say, it could be on that.
and I'm not sure who set that up. So just go back to the slides. That has one more, I think. This one. Oh. Yes, this one. All right. So yeah, the company has Indigenous monitoring programs. And then the IMCs, which I'll describe a little bit later, it's the Indigenous Advisory Monitoring Committees. There's 2 of them right now. And we have set up monitoring programs, Indigenous monitoring programs through those. And we also have another third type of monitoring programs where we hire Indigenous monitors directly through contracts for a third type of a third project that is included. So I'll provide a little bit more clarity on all of this a little bit later, but in terms of monitoring programs by the numbers, in terms of field inspections with the CER, we have over 200 compliance verification activities done since 2017, and the majority of them are on the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and about 140 on that system. Nova Gas Transmission, we have 30, and Enbridge, we have 41. We also had some on the Keystone Pipeline before it got canceled. So, like I mentioned, the IMCs, if you can go to the next slide. I mentioned the IMCs, and which stands for Indigenous Advisory Monitoring Committees. And they were both, there's two of them, one for the Line 3 projects, for Enbridge Line 3, and one for the Trans Mountain projects. And they were both implemented in 2017. And the committees were co-developed through a series of meetings with designated groups to establish shared goals in terms of reference, and which was to provide value in the oversight of each pipeline. There's been many line-wide gatherings, workshops, teleconferences, and like monthly meetings with the various committees and subcommittees. Just a quick note that the committee participation is without prejudice. So whether or not you're for or against the pipeline, you could still participate in that committee and provide your voice to that committee. Each committees are made up of member representative who are represented by potentially impacted from all the potentially impacted nations in their respective provinces, and along with members of the federal government from the Canada Energy Regulator, Natural Resource Canada, Department of Fisheries and Ocean, Environment Canada, and Climate Change, and Parks Canada. And the Line 3 IMC has 15 members from Indigenous Nation, and the TMX IMC has 13 members from Indigenous Nations. So it all started, the IMCs all started from a letter that was sent back in 2016 before, or just, I think just as soon as the project were announced to be approved, from a letter from Chief Ernie Cray, Aaron, I'm going to mispronounce his name, from Lower Chief Aaron from Lower Nicola, sorry, to our Prime Minister, asking for a seat at the table and be able to participate in that. And that's what started the whole IMC process. And it was announced a little bit later that this was going to be supported. So if we go to the next slide. Underground, which is the 140 activities that I mentioned before, are really a big part of what the committee and the achievements that we can talk about here today. And it really is the fundamental part of the relationship with the community and the company and the regulators at the same time. If we can move to the next slide. So the monitoring program, there was a pilot started in 2017, so just a small group of people trying to see how would that work in real life. And at that time, we had a very high level terms of reference for the community overall, but not necessarily for the monitoring program. And so we started working together, understanding what were the needs of each parties. And and then there was a subcommittee, a smaller group of people from the IMC that were designated to really talk about what the framework would look like and how we could co-develop it, so to make sure that everybody would have their say in kind of where we would be going. And the co-development is really important. Like, the government didn't want to go in and say, this is how we're going to do it. We really had an open blank page to start with and talk about kind of how to move forward. And at the end, we traditionally, Indigenous monitors would line up very well with environmental protection inspection. And we expanded the scope to include also safety inspections and also emergency management exercises evaluation, just to make sure that we had a better coverage. And really, the team of the 2 inspectors and the 2 monitors in the field, they really work as a team. So, there's obviously different responsibilities and different, regulated powers and whatnot, legislative power. But they share observations, they discuss enforcement together, and they report together. So it's once they're in the field, the team operates as one. Next page, next slide. So the IMC themselves, the community, the committees. Sorry, just catching up my thoughts here. They're really there to bring some of the concerns to the CR's attention in a, I would say, in a live fashion. We have been participating, our CEO has been participating in line-wide gatherings where we listen and take notes of the concerns that are from the communities themselves. We've introduced some of the things that we've changed is introduce some letter reports. So instead of just normally we would approve compliance, condition compliance and things like that, and just file it on our website. We've introduced a letter report that highlights all of the decisions we're taking and sending that directly to the committee and their communities. Inspection reports, another thing that we've changed is inspection report have a section now for Indigenous monitoring, and and the Indigenous monitor can put their own observation directly into it. We've also had discussion forum where we get the company, the IAMC, and the community if it's to one community specifically, and the CER together in a room to discuss if there's an issue that it's not necessarily compliance related. It's something else that there's an issue there. So we get all 3 parties together and discuss it and find solution forward. And then we've been, obviously at the onset, we had to train the monitors, the Indigenous monitors and the CR inspectors to work together and understand each other's role and responsibilities. Next slide. Obviously, not all of this was always rosy, I have to admit. Sometimes the immediate feedback on our operations was a little bit challenging to implement changes and whatnot. But it was good because it held us accountable to the commitments we made, and also alerted us on challenges that from a community perspective they were perceiving. And some of the example were, we've had discussion forum and other workshops on spawning deterrence, sites of Indigenous significance, kind of trying to understand from a community perspective what are the issues that they're seeing, and from the company perspective what are their limitations sometimes in sharing the information, and found some interesting solution that satisfied all parties in a sense. Another piece is we had a bridging program. So Indigenous monitors were interested. There was an interest in bridging Indigenous monitors to regulatory officers. So coming into a CER and be part of the team. So we've made looked at the program and from the company's perspective and the regulator's perspective into how can we do that and what are the like the requirements in terms of experience and whatnot. And we have started with we have 2 full-time Indigenous monitors that are working for the CR at this time. Next page. So I think I covered a lot of this in terms of lesson learned. You know, one of the key pieces, you know, on my slide is change is hard, and I've mentioned that already. It's not easy when you've been doing it for, you know, since 1959 the same way or very similar way, and slow, you know, moving at the speed of government to actually now change on a weekly basis sometimes and change how people operate in terms of, you know, from a top-down approach in terms of people in the field and whatnot. It hasn't always been easy, but I think the benefit of that work has been seen afterwards. The last piece is the relationship piece on I can't comment enough on the main benefit of all of this was the relationship that we've created with some of the Indigenous monitors, and also, and that relationship, what it translates into is the understanding of what we do and what are they concerned about, but also bringing that information a little bit beyond just the inspection officer and even the monitor, is that monitor will go home after and will speak to their community and say, yeah, I was there, I saw it, and this is what has happened, and you know, I understand the process, and you know, and kind of share the information and add a lot of trust in the whole concept in there. I think that's it for slides.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, I know the monitoring committee started first, and now there's a broader overarching Indigenous advisory committee that actually talks right to the CER board.
Yeah, so so we have a board of directors that oversees the direction of the CR, I would say, and the part of the Act allows for Indigenous advisory committee, and they report directly to the board, so they those direction directly to the upper management, which helps the direction of the CR on that lens.
One other question before we move on is, can you describe a little bit of how both these efforts have perhaps changed the way CER does business or does operations?
How long do you have to?
2 minutes.
It has changed a lot, and you know, obviously the IAMCs originally were not necessarily driven by the CR; they were driven by you know, the Prime Minister, and it was, you need to do this. Since then, we've had other projects that have come through our process, and we're applying some of those good, like the Indigenous monitoring program is a good news story. So we're applying those lessons learned and those principles to those projects that don't have necessarily the bigger structure of the Indigenous advisory committees, but we still apply the same program to those projects. And then Nova Gas Transmission has many of these smaller projects that we're implementing contracted Indigenous monitors.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to talk a little bit right now. You can get the next slide. Did we lose them?
On to the next slide.
We're going to talk about the two big projects that the Indigenous monitoring committees have worked on. And we're going to start with the Line 3 project. Oh, that's the wrong show. Should have been all in the same slide deck. I'm looking at it up here and but we'll get started. I want to introduce Richard, who's an elected council member of the Cowessess First Nation. There we go. And he's just going to talk a little bit about how he got involved and what he got to. Can you go to the next slide? This is the Enbridge Canadian Line 3 replacement, which is what he's been working on, and that kind of shows a map of it. These are major projects, and Richard can describe it a little bit, but you know, it's 1,067 kilometers, which means nothing to me because I'm one of those stupid Americans that can't think in metric. But luckily somebody clued me in. It's over 600 miles, and you know, it's a 48-year-old pipeline that really needed to be upgraded. So take it away, Richard. And I don't want to mess up your last name, so feel free to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Richard Asakin. I'm not patient zero. I just have a little bit of a throat problem, so don't be afraid. But yeah, I'm Soto and Cree. My grandmother was Métis, and so a bit of a mixture there. I'm from Cowessess First Nations. I do live on the reserve. I have a house in the upper subdivision, which we jokingly call the Hollywood Heights. There's a lot of council members that live up there. We make fun of each other a lot, so that's where our name came from. But so Cowessess First Nations is in the Qu'Appelle Valley in southeastern Saskatchewan, and we have Crooked Lake there, and it goes fairly close to. We have actual lands that just east of Regina. We have lands that the pipe goes right by within a few hundred meters. Actually, so we have a vested interest in what goes on with that pipeline. And our philosophy is that we're a Treaty 4 nation. And so for those of you that know about treaties, we made the treaty with the Crown of England. So our nation signed a treaty, and the treaty made Canada. And so we're pre-Canada. And so that's where our kind of power comes from, and that's where our thoughts come from. But anything that happens in Treaty 4, we're part of Treaty 4, we should know about. We don't have the capacity. We've barely had capacity to respond to lots of things. But since I've been involved as a council member, I've taken on the role of stewards of the land, which is land, air, and water. And that involves duty to consult and duty to accommodate, which is a legislated process protected under Section 35 of our Constitution. And where I showed up at a meeting to actually participate in this pipeline, the terms of reference for the committee. Sorry, it'll go away. But so Chief Cadmus Delorme showed up in February 23rd, 2017. And so we know that the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, set forth that there should be committees attached to these areas, Trans Mountain expansion, and then Line 3. And so he went to a meeting in Calgary. He came back and said, they're going to do this committee. You should, you know, tap me on the shoulder, you go. And I helped develop their terms of reference and negotiated all kinds of things with just creating the committee. They wanted a committee member that was part of the terms of reference, so I submitted my name, and in the end, I got selected and appointed. It was a big process where the chiefs had to get together in a room and select you and nominate you, and then you get confirmed by government, and then you get appointed to that committee. It's quite the process. I thought it was very good vetting. Well, they got me, so just kidding. I'm very humble.
Where's the Line 3 replacement at these days? Is it a done project?
Yeah, October 22nd is completely decommissioned. So when the committee was started, it actually was already under construction in Alberta. So we had Alberta members that couldn't really be involved. And we manage poverty every day in every nation. And there's over 600 nations in Canada. And there's a lot in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And so when they see pipeline and major project, and that's a $7 billion project. And so it's very valid for nations to try to get and direct some of that money towards their nation so they can get contracts. But Bannister, I believe, was the general contractor, and they already had their subcontractors laid out and they were already under construction. And so we did help create the monitor program to do construction monitoring on the line and to do post-construction monitoring and then even decommissioning monitoring and integrity digs and all this stuff I'm learning myself. You know, I'm a trained counselor, not I'm an elected council member, but I got a master's of science in counseling. And so it does help me, but this is all really new. This file is really huge, stewards of the land. But being part of this pipeline, you learn the language, you learn the major project lingo, you learn what goes into everything. Pipeline safety, I'm still on I was the subcommittee chair of emergency management, and I did webinars and trying to linkage dollars to nations, and so they can help out build capacity for our response if there's ever incidents in the local area. But yeah, it was decommissioned on October 22nd, just a month ago, basically.
Can you think of, just off the top of your head, one of the recommendations that the monitoring committee made that changed what Enbridge was going to do or changed what CER was planning to do?
Yeah, well, one of the things that we really want to do, and I know with TMX Trans Mountain Expansion, they have this decision called Delgamuke, culturally modified trees, culturally modified areas. And what we're trying to do with monitoring is identify culturally modified landscapes. I know Mark isn't really aware of that, but for me and for our nation, you know, Mike Oka, one of our committee members, he's very wise. He's very protective of cultural heritage, but even teepee rings are evidence that we existed in these areas. And so when a pipeline goes through, rocks just get tossed aside, but that's evidence of our existence. So some of the things we're trying to do is just protect cultural heritage, you know, those chance finds, and create a protocol to actually deal with chance finds like that, as far as First Nations burials and objects and artifacts are concerned. That's one of our influences.
Great, thanks. If you think you had a hard time getting here, Richard and Chief Shackley both came from
Vancouver.
Had some exciting times getting in and out of Vancouver, and Chief Shackley actually had to get across the border and fly out of Bellingham the day after I left, and spent too much time getting across the bridges and stuff in Vancouver. We're going to move on to the TMX expansion project, and just I'd like to introduce both Chief Shackley. Next slide, please. His bio is there. You know, he was reelected for his second term as chief in November 2016, and I'll let you read the rest of it. He's a member of the advisory monitoring committee for the Line 3 expansion. And Sean Brett, next slide, is the Senior Director of Environmental Health and Safety for Trans Mountain Expansion Project. And I'm really interested to hear about this because Trans Mountain actually crosses the border, and I drive right across the pipeline every day coming and going. So they're not expanding in the U.S. It was a Canadian-based thing. And next slide. There's a picture of the Trans Mountain Expansion Project, which goes all the way from kind of the tar sands up in Alberta all the way down to Vancouver, more or less. And I'll let Sean has put together some slides, and I'll let him walk through those.
Sure. I thought I'd give an introduction to the project. It's a pretty large project. It's probably the largest infrastructure project in Canada today. We're a small mid-sized company. We're the only company that's actually shipping product to the West Coast, to overseas markets for Canada. Our current capacity is about 300,000 barrels a day. With this project, we're tripling that to about 900,000. So we're building 980 kilometers of new 36-inch pipe, plus we're reactivating 193 of existing pipe. In addition to the pipe, we're building 19 new tanks, 12 new pump stations, and a large marine terminal with 3 berths to allow Afro-Max size tankers to come. It's a $21 billion project. I'm very proud to say that to date, we have over $4.5 billion of committed contracts to Indigenous communities as well. So it's a big part of our who we are as a company. And if you go through these slides, it just gives you a little bit of flavor of what the project's like. A lot of steep terrain. We start in Edmonton, we cross over the Rocky Mountains, we go through provincial parks, national parks, lots of steep slopes. We have, we almost call it a major trenchless project because we have over 80 major trenchless crossings, hundreds of minor trenchless crossings. Next slide. Some more pictures of the main line. We also go through a lot of urban areas. So in addition to some of the areas that we go through in the mountainous terrain, where in the picture, you know, the top left, we're in people's backyards. Bottom right, we're right next to highways. And if you go to the next slide, I'm also happy to say we're 77% complete as of this year. So we'll be wrapping up next year, and we're into the reclamation phases and mainly in Alberta, moving west. And if you go to the next slide, this just gives you an example of two of our terminals. The bottom picture is the Edmonton terminal, and the top right is our Burnaby terminal that has the largest expansion. And this next slide is one of the most exciting things. I came onto the project in 2017, and we started. This is kind of where we started, the Westridge Marine Terminal. You'll see there the picture. There's 3 new berths, and we actually had to build that entire foreshore to be earthquake resistant to bring in those new ships. It's been. I was talking to Mark on the way here. It's been probably one of the most complex projects. You know, we filed back in 2013. We got our original certificate to construct, and then that certificate was taken away. So there were a few Indigenous communities that put together a lawsuit because the Crown's duty to consult said wasn't sufficient. Essentially, they won. We had to go back. The government had to reconsult for the marine portion of the project. They did that. We got our new certificate and restarted construction again. And it was funny. The day after our certificate was taken away, our company got sold to the Canadian government, and then we went through that process. Then we got our certificate back, and then we went through a season of fires. Us and everyone that work with us, season of extreme fires in Western Canada that a lot of people have heard. And then last year had one of the largest natural disasters in Canadian history with the flood. So it's been an interesting time. So that's kind of the project in a nutshell.
The pipeline still owned by the Canadian government?
The pipeline is still owned by the Canadian government. Yep. And so as we're moving through, that will be kind of one of the futures. Is, you know, everyone's talking about the sale of the company in the future.
All right. And Chief Shackley works on the Indigenous Advisory and Monitoring Committee for the Trans Mountain Expansion Project. You want to tell us a little bit about yourself, Chief Shackley, and how you got involved and what you think about the whole project?
Yeah, so Chief Marcel Shackley from the Nuytjinyin Band, a member of the unceded Ntlaka'pamux territory. So I reside in my community in Nuytj, as well as in Vancouver in the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. So usually when we have our meetings, we start with a prayer. We have an opening, maybe a welcoming song. Pre-COVID, what we used to do is we would move our meeting along the corridor, the right-of-way corridor. So we'd go into the communities and sit with them and enjoy food with them and hear their conversations. And when we had it in Merritt, we've never seen a project this size. So with that influx of workers, staying in worker accommodation sites, I didn't know what impact that was going to have on my people, on my women, on my youth, on the drug problems, on the alcohol problems, on violence, homelessness. So we did have a ceremony for the missing and murdered Indigenous women, so that we weren't just kind of thinking about it. So shifting it from there into the heart, where it's like, feel it with us, so that we can make the changes that we need to make. So we do monitoring on the social impacts. So there's a couple of pilot projects, one in the Fraser Valley area, another one in the interior closer to Alberta, and another Alberta monitoring program, monitoring social economic impacts. So to actually zero in and look at those things, we're hoping that the act of observation is going to change the outcome. So everybody on the committee participated in that. So when I'm working with the other Indigenous communities across the corridor, we sit with the federal regulators. So when we have concerns and issues, it's not, I don't go to Mark and Mark says, hey, no, go talk to the guys over there. And then they send me to the next room and the next room. We bring everybody into the same room and have the conversation once. So the efficiency is a lot greater, improved, the communication and the relationship buildings. So instead of the actual committee, that's been pretty solid. So if somebody was a chief and then they move, they still retain their seat. So a lot of the federal committee members are the same. But I mean, the communities that are represented, we have annual meetings with those communities every year. Because out of 129, I can guarantee you that the leadership's going to change. That the people coming to hear our story are going to change. So we got to keep on with that message and listen to their concerns. And so when we give our presentations, we tell them, this is what you told us last year, and this is what we've done this year. So I think that we're heading in the direction that you're pointing us in. And that way, it's a reflection of their concerns and interests being accommodated or any impacts mitigated. The salmon in my area, really, really big and important to my people. So the sockeye salmon and protecting those for future generations. So making sure that this project doesn't impact them negatively. So if my community members came in and said, hey, chief, what's happening over here? That's what the IAMC does, is they mobilize the Indigenous monitors to go out there and check with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans to make sure that what we say is happening is actually happening. That way I can go back to the community member and say, hey, it's being looked after, it's being taken care of. We'll check back again in a little bit to make sure that everything was wrapped up.
Can you give us a specific example of where you provided input in either CER or Trans Mountain has changed what they were going to do?
There was the use of what they were calling anti-spawning mats inside of the right-of-way corridor. So they installed these mats. Procedurally, you're supposed to get a Section 9 permit. And that section actually shifted. I forget what the new number is, but a permit to actually make changes in and about a stream. So they were installed in one area. And once we heard about it, then that became the hot topic. And the whole committee was in an uproar because it wasn't done correctly. So after that, they had agreed to not utilize those mats and try other methods, either drilling, I forget what it's called, directional drilling. Yeah. So finding other ways to gain access.
I'm assuming that these committees are kind of expensive to have your meetings and to pay for your monitors. And from what I've read, you help fund projects in different communities and stuff too. Can someone talk about the funding that has flowed to both committees? Can anybody put kind of a bounds on that? It seems like I read that maybe Line 3 got $30 million and Trans Mountain got 50. The monitoring committees.
Yeah, tell us why you got more. I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
And and the reason I bring that up, that sounds like an astounding amount of money for communities in the U.S. that don't get nothing.
I'll take a quick stab at this question. So we talked about the first certificate of public convenience and necessity. So in the failure to actually achieve a level of consultation and accommodation, so when it was found that they were deficient, go back and consult. So that time delay, the valuation of time. So it went from a $7.4 billion project, 14.8. So even today, 14.8, that actually sounds like a bargain because now it's over 20 billion. So to really evaluate the value of time. So if the concerns and interests were met the first time, then maybe we would have still been closer to the 7.4. So the amount of funding that we did receive, 60 million versus an additional 7.4 billion, the 60 million to me sounds like a bargain. So I've seen so many projects that go through the consultation process and the negotiators and the positions that they take, it burns off time. And that time in terms of being able to implement and execute on time, on budget, right? So with inflation doing what it's doing right now, could you imagine if you were going to start a project last year versus this year, how much more expensive that's going to be? My only comments in relation to the amount of funding.
I was going to say something. The TMX, the Trans Mountain, got a lot more money to operate as a committee because they had to do studies on marine biology and marine life and tidewater and all that kind of stuff. And then Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, it's a much larger span, but it's prairie land and it's mostly private land, and it's probably about 2% that is Crown land, which is public land. And so there's about 119 nations that are impacted, but realistically, there's more like 137. And so we have a lot of, all those meetings that we have to go to, we have to do studies, we have to hire consultants, and the money that we get, it doesn't involve a lot of studies for whales or marine life and that kind of thing.
I can add one additional thing to the overall budget. Does Canada get to ship its oil to market or not? So to allow $60 billion to cap the potential development of its oil resources. So to see how much resources are sitting behind it, 60 million is.
So it's interesting, you're talking about having to do these biological studies and those things that are expensive, and that's where the money went. Can you talk a little bit about how the committee operates? I mean, are you independent, or who decides who to hire for those types of studies? Is that a committee decision?
Yeah, we usually get involved in the hiring of people. The Secretariat, it's Government Natural Resources Canada. We do have committee members that participate in hiring of their staff. And then we have our own contribution agreements from the nations. So we do pay consultants that we hire, we decide. So we hire, we fire, that kind of thing. But most of the committee members that do this, like for me, it's off the side of our desk. It's not our full-time job. We just kind of do this in very limited time, extra time throughout the day. But it does take over most of the day. I would say we have a lot of autonomy. They give us the money, we decide, we set the budget, and we spend it according to what we need to do for our priorities.
Where's the money come from? Is that from the federal government, or is it from Enbridge and Trans Mountain?
Well, interesting. We just finished our line wide at the line 3, and some young lady asked me personally, how come Enbridge is dictating your guys' committee? And so the impression from her first meeting was that Enbridge gives us money to invite people to this meeting, but we get money directly from the Canadian government. It's kind of flowed through NRCan, and it's flowed through nations. They get their admin fee, but in the end, we decide whether Enbridge is going to be at our table or not. And so I had to inform her that the misconception that Enbridge is sponsoring all this kind of stuff, no. This goes deeper than its reconciliation, its inclusion, and for Article 18 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, we have a right to participate in decisions that affect our rights as Indigenous people. So this is where it's going, and yeah, we get the money from the government just like anything else, and we decide what to do with it.
Do you have anything to add to that? One of the questions I know will come up, and I'll just ask it now instead of waiting for the audience, is that we've heard of a lot of opposition to both Line 3 and the TMX expansion. How does the committee deal with opposition, and are committee members who are opposed or have concerns included?
No, the way that I would view it would be the government was saying we will build it at all costs. You have another group that says they'll build it body, right? So where do we meet? I believe that the IMC is kind of meeting in the middle, where it's if it's going to be built, build it right. So no cutting the corners, kind of watching each movement and being comfortable with each one of those movements. So I believe the IAMC is meeting in the middle. So we have committee members that have signed off on agreements and tracks on the project, on the Trans Mountain expansion. And we have other communities that took them to court. And we all sit at the same table. So the elimination of those silos of us versus them, where it's like, no, us versus us. Help us, help you, help us.
Mark, do you think it has helped? Has, you know, I think these things always get put together because there's been trust lost and people are trying to rebuild trust. Has this helped?
Yeah, I think it has helped, and like you just mentioned, trust is the piece that had eroded in the past, and I'm not saying they're 100% now, but it's definitely much better than it was at the beginning.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think when the IMAC was first created, you talked about the collaboration. When it was collaborated between the communities and the government. The company wasn't involved, and so when it first came into being, it wasn't easy. Mark and I were talking about this again. There was really a lack of identification of where the roles and responsibility, what's in scope, what's out of scope. So for the company management, it was confusing, but more importantly on the ground, the company has an Indigenous monitoring program. We have a lot of procedures and policies. And so it really started impacting the folks on the ground at first, when it first came into being. The Indigenous monitors were put in conflict with the IMAC Indigenous monitors because they were asking questions that, nobody knew, is this in scope? Is this out of scope? It was almost as if we felt like the end zone on compliance kept shifting and was blurred. And so what had happened was leadership from each group, so from the CER, from the IMAC, and from the company, all committed to making this work. So they sat down, they said, we're going to make this work. And, the session this morning, there was that nice process that was developed in terms of this is what it's going to look like. And now we're going to stand up this policy. As Mark was saying, it was more like here, okay, make it work now. And then kind of build the ship as you're flying it. So what happened is, and Chief Marcel and I were on this, it was a policy table. So it was senior leadership from each group came together to start basically talking. And there wasn't a lot of trust at the beginning. There was some confusion, and over time, a lot of in-person meetings, workshops. I remember meeting, we met in Vancouver or Calgary. After time, we started gaining the trust. And then it wasn't until the policy table developed a shared goal. So it was an objective-based goal that we said, okay, this is what we are all aspiring to. So Trans Mountain, for your program and for your participation, you're trying to achieve this goal. IMAC, CR, you're trying to achieve this goal. And then that kind of helped us. That was our North Star to figure out, where we could go. And ever since then, we started gaining traction. And I think we're in a pretty good place today where people are getting out on the ground, like the IMAC monitors, Indigenous monitors are on the ground. Our Indigenous monitors are on the ground. Our Indigenous monitors are reporting back to the community. The Indigenous monitors for IMAC reporting back to the committee and to the communities. And I think through that kind of overlap of participation from both programs, we're getting a lot of kind of cycle back and forth of feedback from the community. But it wasn't easy at first. It was pretty challenging for the first year or two.
All right, we've got about 15 minutes left, and I have a whole list of questions, but I really want to let people out in the audience ask some stuff too. Is there anything any of you want to say that make sure they understand how this works? I'm assuming a lot of people, this is the first they've heard of this whole effort north of the border. Should we open it up and see what All right, who's got questions?
I do.
How would I know that?
Yeah, what a surprise. This is great. And this is really insightful for a lot of reasons and very applicable to the U.S. or what I hope could be applicable to the U.S. I'm curious to hear from both industry people and from tribal members, First Nations people, how you're incorporating Indigenous knowledge into. You're talking about studies that's very scientific, very colonial, and some would argue. And so I'm curious where the Indigenous knowledge piece comes in and incorporating this in some of these decision making around siting pipelines, planning pipelines, and monitoring pipelines.
Hi, yeah, well, that's a big question because there's traditional land use studies that we do. That's proprietary to the nation. We don't share those because some of that is cultural. And of course, some of it is berry picking areas. And in fact, some of the corridors that are reclamated actually become some of the best berry picking places. So it's important for us to protect that pipeline so there's no incidences, or if there's an incident, you respond right away because that's where the best berries are. Sometimes it's strange, but what was your question again about?
I was curious how Indigenous knowledge gets.
Right. Yeah, I was getting on a tangent there.
It had nothing to do with proprietary, but obviously a lot of tribes.
Yeah. Well, we got worldview written right into our terms of reference. And so what are our values? What are our takeaways? And inclusion is part of that. So how do we introduce worldview to a compliance driven industry where they give certificates of convenience and they have to do filings that are in compliance? And how do you measure that? That's the huge job. So how do we shape the lens in which the CER looks at a project? And they have to have a consideration that is First Nations value driven to also place on that. And that's where the tough work starts. So we can do a lot of the monitoring and protection of things that are tangible and tactile, but realistically, idealistically, how do you incorporate the values of First Nations people that an agency like the NEB, now the CER, has taken decades upon decades to evolve into its own sovereignty protection and, giving certificates of convenience so that companies can go in and make a lot of money. And so when you introduce First Nations people, the worldview is very important because trust is important, but respect also is very important. And so that's where a lot of the work has to take place. And that's a very diplomatic process. You got a lot of angry people on both sides. You got a lot of ignorance on both sides. And really, it's just like our first 2 years on our committee is just headbutting, not only with industry, not only with the CER, the NEB at the time. We had Peter Watson, the chairman, coming to a lot of our events. And it's just being seen and being talked to and listening. And you might think that that's all just touchy-feely kind of stuff. But realistically, if we as First Nations people don't see you anywhere, how can we trust that? And so if you don't listen to what our worldview is and validate it with us, then what's the point? And so we can shape industry as well, but in a good way, if we just got to find those answers.
Yeah, and maybe I'll add from an industry perspective. So in terms of incorporating Indigenous knowledge, there were three kind of main ways we did. One is the traditional kind of studies, as Richard was talking about, that we use in our application and whatnot. The second is through relationships. So working with communities as partners was part of the values and vision of our previous president and continues today with our current leadership. And so we started these discussions with the communities back before the project filed its application and everything. Those developed partnerships that we're going to continue through operations in terms of maintenance, but it's through those relationships that we also gain knowledge about what's important. So for example, there were 2 areas that were considered sacred areas of these communities. And so even though we had already kind of done our routing, we changed our route. Or in one case, we actually committed to trenchless crossing throughout the entire area. It's now one of the most critical parts of our project, but it's one of the promises that we made. And it's through those ongoing relationships and the sharing of information and the building of relationships that, they come to us and say, this is a really important place. Can we need to do something about this? And then we sit down and we talk about what we can do. And, just because a pipe, and that's actually happened, I think, 2 other times on the project where the route's already decided, but we learn after about something that's important, so we change our route around it. And then the third is through the Indigenous monitoring program. So we have Indigenous monitors out on the site as integrated members of our environmental inspection team. So they have all the same rights, responsibilities. They're in chart. They're out there with the inspectors. We have a bridging program. They can become inspectors. But if they come to a situation where they say, "Hey, hold on here," whether it's a culturally modified tree or we had an Indigenous monitor from Chief Marcel's community, and Chief Marcel, you're going to have to correct me. I forget the actual traditional name, but it was the water spirit. We were coming to a place where there were some water spirits, and we wanted the monitor said we should do a ceremony, and then we arranged for a special ceremony to be held before we started construction in that area. But it's not something you could do or know beforehand. And these are all great, but it really has to come down to the company and to the people in their leadership positions and the values and the vision, right? So for us, fortunately, we had leadership that were really, this was part of who they felt the company should be. And so we're part of that value and vision, which has made it part of how we do our work. But I know not every company has that leadership that share that same perspective.
Time for maybe one more question.
Actually, I'll add a little bit to that as well. So the other way to do it is to hire the monitors, train the monitors from the communities. So their ability to take their monitor and their monitor to go back to their elders to ask more sensitive questions where they might not give it to me, but they'll give it to one of their own people. So, and inside of the preparation, they would have time, the monitor would have time to go out to the community and ask questions to make sure that they were mostly informed to be able to work in that area.
In Canada, for the programs that you're talking about, setting up the committees and funding them, have they been applied to other communities? Like, I don't know if you use the same terminology, but what we would describe as environmental justice communities. Do they do that in Canada? And then associated with that, you said the money comes from the Canadian government. Is it out of the general fund, or is it based on an assessment of oil and gas, or whose money is it that comes down? I'm just curious, thinking about ways to replicate it in the U.S.
Yeah, in terms of where your last question there, in terms of where the money comes from, it's the general. It's not necessarily associated to anything. It's just the general funds. In terms of the other part of your question, and now I just forgot, just lost it.
Oh, it's I think it was other programs like.
Yeah, there is participant funding that is available for all projects, and if you want to participate in any aspect of, especially on the application side, there's participant funding that's available for anybody who wants to participate. So not only Indigenous people. In terms of larger committees like that, there might be others similar, but not to that scale for sure.
Have any of the provinces started to kind of replicate this on the pipelines they oversee? Because it's a little different in Canada about who, well, the provinces oversee a lot of pipelines.
Yeah, maybe Chief Marcel, you might be able to speak to. I think there's a few programs in BC.
Provincially, the overarching principles of the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People. So the federal government adopted that, but also British Columbia is one of the only provinces that's actively working on this. So my community is kind of at the ground zero of the 2021 atmospheric river. So we've seen water flows that it's a 1 in 750 year event, which destroyed infrastructure surrounding us. So after working on this committee and trying to work with the province, I said, this is how we should do it. We should get all the players in the same room at the same time and have conversations about this. So trying to mimic what we're doing on this committee, but on a provincial scale, related to infrastructure, not pipeline or the British Columbia Oil and Gas Commission type work.
Yeah, and I know the BC Environmental Assessment Office, I believe, has a similar program for Indigenous monitoring, and I know the BC Archaeology branch, which is part of the Ministry of Natural Resources for Flintro, they also, I believe, have some similar type of programs that they're starting to start up as well.
Yeah, Richard. Then we need to wrap it up.
Yeah. Also, I just want to quickly say too that Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba have very conservative governments, and British Columbia has a new Democratic Party, and so there's the difference there in approaches and inclusiveness. But for Saskatchewan, you got to give them kudos. So in other areas, they are starting to hire Indigenous advisors as individuals, attaching them to their internal agencies to help them navigate Native issues wherever they confront them. So it's a good effort in Canada to reconcile and be inclusive, and also let First Nations be part of those decisions that are going to affect the future. So, yeah.
Great. Help me thank these folks for coming so far. To give us some and I wish we had more time because I can see there's some pent up questions, but they'll be around. Thank you. Thank you.
Totally got in. I got just right at lunch.
I
arrived right at lunch. I spent the night at the hotel or the airport.
I want to see it. Can I just get a picture?
Oh, yes, that would be great.
I don't want
Only if you send it to me.
I don't want any evidence.
Yeah, it's got to be in the middle of Bourbon Street as well.
Yeah. That's for later. Oh yeah.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Thank you.
Oh, yes.
It's just like if you put the constant.
The charge
Same place. You and I are in the same place.
And would you be able to send me a copy?
Yes, if you email address.
So you said, I played it 100%, but I'm not sure. A little more, done by the loss of understanding what you and I understand it.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're in the middle of that came in, that was a huge problem. It's really difficult. We don't have much over non-natives within our boundaries, so we fit this way.
Well, we have a blend. I mean, like I see the casino revenues down here, but I mean, for the most part, we don't have tribal police.
Oh, you don't have police?
No.
You don't have your own police?
No.
Oh, so we get our own police. And they can stuff with them. And other tribal members, they got no oversight on. And so they have to work with the federal land on difficult. So where I live, I'm kind of in the projects. I don't, but I literally live in the projects and that's the neighborhood. And it's good because there's no crime. Nobody wants to bring attention to it. And I got a lot of nice stuff there. But it's a non-native who sells the drugs right across the street from me, and everybody knows it. And they're probably police do something. It has no teeth. You need the federal people to do it. So if he was non-native, he would have been prison. So we get all this federal, it's kind of review. But it's really hard to address it unless you get the feds. We don't have the majority of non-native people within our boundaries. It makes it really tricky.
Yeah, we would have the ability to have them removed from the reserve. I mean, so they could sit, but kind of the structure quite a bit different. So if this is my territory, little square down here, that's me. My cousin over here, there, and so we all have like little tiny pieces.
Yeah.
So our reserve versus the territory.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. We did that before when they wanted to protest military deaths. So one of our tribal members is killed in Iraq. We banned any of these protesters from entering our reservation. They made that an executive rule. You cannot have any protesters on funerals. And so it stopped because that's not how popular all of it is. By banning them, giving them so that's one of the ways to do it. You ready, Rita?
Hey, how are you?
Dave's gonna sit over there, isn't he?
No, he's standing.
Well, we can all move over one.
What's so funny?
Do you want to?
Oh, it's up to you. It is.
We can move over one if you want. That's
Dave
fine.
is, yeah. Or
As long as he has a spot there on the end.
What do we do?
I guess move over one.
This is freezing.
Yeah. It is. This on the floor.
So far, no bosses. That's good.
Yeah, well, Bill.
Oh, really good.
Oh no.
All right, folks, we're on a short time frame, so let's go ahead and get started here.
No one's here. We got everybody here. Have you had any of the candy? I went to have one. I couldn't get the wrapper off. It was so stuck on. So
it looks like it's melted onto.
the trays melted on on the table. What?
All right, folks, I got 2 hours to go through the federal regulations, so let's do it.
Let's get going.
I know it's tight to get from one room to the other and everything.
I guess.
told them to turn on the AC, the air conditioning down here. I know it's a little warm, right?
It's freezing in here.
It is.
Stupid not to have time between sessions.
All right, hi folks. I'm Dave Mulligan from PHMSA, so I'm a community liaison out of the Denver office. So the Western region. So we have the 12 states from Colorado west, including Alaska and Hawaii is kind of the region I call home. Just going through. Skipped on. So I wanted to give a little history of the community liaison program within PHMSA, right? The Office of Pipeline Safety. So a while back, we were originally called CATS, right? Community Assistance and Technical Services Program. Formerly CATS manager. Hated that name. So I'm the one that was guilty. I hated explaining what CATS meant and what it took me, forever to do that abbreviation. So back in 2016, the team, we adopted the CL, right? Community liaison. Made sense. We liaison between, all sorts of stakeholders. So it fit. Where this position was created from, or this team was created from, goes back to the 2002, back then it was PSIA Act, which was the Pipeline Safety Improvement Act. And what they came up with out of that act was, right, Bellingham, integrity management and everything. But they said, okay, how do we interface? We need more public education out there, right, to get the word out there about pipeline safety. Also, damage prevention was becoming big, right? The 811 program, that number across the country. And then also, I don't know why it's moving forward on its own. Enhanced stakeholder communication, and then just the assistant permitting process. So that's when we came out with operators, if you find you need to make this repair or explore from this data you got from the pipeline, you got to dig it up within a certain amount of time. Well, permitting agencies, right, weren't that quick, right? You have a 60-day repair and they had to apply for a permit to dig in that area. So we need some kind of mechanism, and that's kind of where that CATS or community liaison program came in. We can't override the state, but we can work with them and explain, or whoever's given that permit, why these pipeline companies want to get in there and take a look at, where this came up. Some forwarded on its own, doesn't it?
That means you thought it was me. Have a clean slide.
All right, so we came up with our own mission, right, to be specialized since we're more outward facing. So rather than internal inspectors and everything, we're more out facing to get to the community members, public stakeholders, whatever you guys want to call it, right? It's all thrown in there. So we came up with a kind of credible stewards of pipeline safety throughout the country. Team members. So I included the other team members up here. There's 10 of us across the country, 2 in each region. From my left, I got Artie, who's in the southern region, Nita, eastern region, and then Sean is central region. And a couple of them are going to go through some examples of how community liaison, right, assisted any stakeholder, landowners, somebody from the public. All right, so roles and responsibilities. I could go on all day, and each one is a corner case, but
That was quick.
yeah, done. So I broke it down into these 6 things. I guess I'll go off on my other computer.
Yeah, he can unplug it.
You unplug this?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just say that.
Yeah.
Thank you. So public engagement, of course, I put it up here, right? We're at the Pipeline Safety Trust. First of all, love coming here, love meeting, all the different groups and interaction and questions. So, typically when somebody calls in to us or we get a call from the public, we're the first person that somebody from PHMSA talks to, either this landowner or it could be anyone that's seeking information. So during that call, first of all, they're like, who is PHMSA? And what does this abbreviation stand for? Right? So we have to kind of coach them in terms of, what we do, why we're here to help them, and then also, move on to get them the information that they want. So usually a public engagement or public information call comes in, and it's usually, inquiry by phone. It could be email through our regular email system, or it could be during meetings just like this, right? That we're doing something out there, that you approach us and you just need some more information or some current concerns. So that's one of them. Landowners, could be a landowner complaint, could be advocacy groups, or any one of those. I wanted to mention, and FERC did this great, right? So John, if you're out there, so when somebody calls you and they finally get a phone, right? A person on the phone rather than a voicemail. We try not to pass it off saying, that's not part of our job, right? It's not in our regulations, it's not part of it. That's somebody else. We're real good at trying to find that person who took the time to call us to say, here's who you need to call. We built a great database for ourselves that we have contacts with FERC, EPA, other people out there or within the state to kind of give them an avenue. And I think that really helps rather than saying it's not in our wheelhouse. Next going down is kind of our real bread and butter is the outreach program. In this program, right, is where we go out, we do presentations of all, it could be a damage prevention program. It could be meetings like this, presentations on public awareness program also, to kind of do that outreach and go to those different places and, kind of communicate. Moving out of that is regional support. So with us being outward facing, we also want to take that information back, what we're hearing from the public or what kind of engagements we're having to the region team. So our inspectors, we also want to communicate with our inspectors that here's kind of also from their end, how they perform inspections. So if we're talking with people with the public, we want to be able to understand and talk intellectually about, hey, when our inspectors are out there in the field, what are they doing? How do they do their inspection process? And go through that. Technical assistance is the next one. And this is kind of the calls, and this can be from industry, it can be from other government agencies, state agencies, is about what are your regulations, right? We have this issue, or do you have a regulation on this? How do you interpret this? Where do we find information on that? So that's really coming from, it could be marine damage prevention, pipeline safety regulations, rule updates, our national pipeline mapping system that's out there to the public and to the state resources, and then also take those requirements back and kind of influence change within our organization to get that. Moving next is working groups and committees and teams. This is kind of like API, NACE. NACE has a new name right now.
Yeah.
And I always forget that. I always want to go with ACE. INGA, right, NGA, AGA, all those different organizations. It could be those support groups or those industry meetings that we go to when we talk and we communicate with that outside group. Also within our wheelhouse is R&D program. So R&D program is we have a lot of grants out there, right? And it gets very confusing to kind of publicize those grants to the right people. So since we're outward facing, we'll take that information, those brochures, to go out there and give them that information. Post-incident support. So when it's a larger incident, I didn't get a chance to watch Chris's presentation, Chris and Kim West's presentation. But if it's a large incident and they need assistance that's outward facing at that command post, we'll get a call from them that, you know, to go through that and assist them in the field so that their inspectors, their investigators can focus on the pipe and we can focus on assisting the incident command. Next slide. I'm not going to go through all these, so there's just kind of a same thing, roles and responsibilities. I wanted to throw it up there. Next slide. And then we use stakeholders, right? Stakeholders mean many things. It really is whoever has an interest or concern or anything about these underground regulated pipelines. So it could be somebody in the right of way. It could be somebody across the country that has a concern about them. So wanted to throw that out there. As you can see at the top, it's public. And then we also have the tribal officials, you know, state and local, kind of within that same federal agency and administration umbrella. So with it, while we're collecting this information, we come out with the top 10 stakeholder concerns, right? So we break this down, we get together as a group throughout the regions. You know, you can see the top 3. One, abandoned pipelines. We always get questions about, you know, I'm a landowner, I have this pipeline on there, they say it's abandoned, can somebody remove it? And it is very difficult to track down abandoned pipelines. We're very good at 20 years recent, but 40 years ago, extremely difficult. And this has been kind of a concern that some states do it a lot better in their call before you dig program, the 811 program, their abandoned lines, about who owned it last, that pipeline. Right now, if I go back 5 years, I can find that history, but it's those older pipelines that we get questions on. Of course, newer replaced pipelines doing a lot of work, right? They're putting in new construction. That's when it's going to drive a lot of our public inquiries. And then right-of-way issues. A lot of it is maybe farming or putting a building on it. How come I can't put a building on this easement where the federal regulations on there? Hurry up, I see you. So top 10 stakeholders. Now I'm going to dive into some examples. Next one. So I wanted to bring you with some live examples of how we help. So this is an example, got a call from a landowner or a homeowner, vibration problem, right? This pipeline, you can kind of see the walkway that's right in between the middle of the houses. That's a pipeline corridor for a gas transmission line. They said, hey, it's not all the time. I feel vibration. I can't sleep at night. I don't know if I'm hearing things or what. So actually, I went out there and talked with the person, kind of understood their problem. It's amazing what you can do once you feel them face to face. Went down with the pipeline operator, talked to them, had them come out there, and it wasn't happening at that time. They go, but we think we have a cure. They think if we do certain valving, certain times a day or certain demand, it was a reciprocating compressor. They changed that valve, it solved the whole problem. So that was one I was kind of proud of, that it was a quick turnaround. Operator is willing to cooperate. Next slide. San Pedro, so about a year ago, this is right at a little over a year ago, right? San Pedro pipeline. This was an offshore pipeline off the coast of Long Beach. I was called out there. I was actually I was just sitting down to watch the Denver Broncos lose. I got called out there. And, Chief Hornaday said it is learn, kind of repeat the same things that went good. And I thought this went good, didn't go perfect. I set up with the command post. Our investigators got to investigate. We did normal briefings with the incident command. We gave them an update. Their focus is cleanup, get it under control. Our focus is pipeline. we wanted that communication going back because when that Coast Guard gets on the mic in front of the media, they get those kind of questions. They want that information to back it up. So we kept them informed. Also, I held regular meetings with the local, state, federal agencies within there and gave them a pipeline update, and they could pass it down to their local communities and that information. But there's always one person or one item where the communication breaks down. And I was at fault at this. It's one of those, you ever send out an email, you have a whole list, and then right when you send it, you're like, oh, I forgot to include this agency or this person or whatever. So you take it back, put it on. Next one you send out, you take the old email list, right, and reply, and you're like, forgot it again. So communication always improved, right? And that's a lesson that I've learned. I think the next slide is Artie.
Thank you, Dave.
Yep.
Sort of following up with some of the examples Dave gave, I'm going to go over an actual example of one that I was involved with, where I actually met the landowner of this property, and Dave mentioned how helpful that is, and it is really helpful. And you get a different perspective when you're out there than when you're just talking about it with the landowner. But before I go over that, landowner issues sort of fall into two categories. One involves the right-of-way and issues with the right-of-way, such as overgrowth, depressions, erosion. I had one example where there was really bad erosion and a lot of the pipeline was actually exposed. And in rural areas along right-of-ways, they're very popular for hunting. And you don't want a hunter hitting an exposed high-pressure pipeline. And the other one involves landowners that have a pipeline on their property or want to move in an area where there's a gas transmission pipeline. And in a case like that, what we do is provide the landowner information. We tell them there's a federal organization, PHMSA, that's tasked with pipeline safety. And I also send them to PIPA's webpage, Pipeline Informed Planning Alliance. They provide really good information to developers, to homeowners, zoning boards, local governments on how to safely, or just information on developing property near or on a gas transmission pipeline. So once the landowner or the acquirer has all this information, at least they can make a decision how comfortable they feel either buying property or living near a pipeline. So now let me get to the example. If you look at that picture, this was a piece of property in California. And if you're wondering why a southern region, CL, went to California, because it's not the state of California, it's California, Kentucky, the town of California. But this is a photo of the property, and he had depressions on the right-of-way. Beautiful piece of property. He has grandchildren. Grandchildren play on the property, and he was concerned that this was a safety hazard. And PHMSA doesn't have requirements for maintaining right-of-way. We have patrolling requirements, and the operator was pretty much meeting those requirements. So the only other thing I could raise with the operator is this a safety-related condition? Is this a change condition? Could you take a look at it? Could these depressions possibly affect the safety of the pipeline? But anyway, this went on for about 2 years, email conversations, phone conversations with the landowner, and eventually I decided, well, let me go take a look at it. And I'll tell you, when you look at a picture of the property, and I always ask for pictures, you don't get the same view as if you're there in person. Because in person, those depressions are a lot deeper than they look in the photograph. And you can see a little bit of it with that all-terrain vehicle, which he took me around the property in. And he does have a really nice piece of property. But anyway, we did get it resolved. He has the ability, he has the equipment to fill the depressions himself. So we work with the operator. Would you pay this guy to do it? And they finally agreed to pay him to fill in the depressions. I gave him $5,000, so he probably made out pretty good on the deal. But anyway, we did get it resolved, and that's a typical landowner example, and that occurs frequently among all the community liaisons.
Next slide, Rita.
I didn't even leave the quicker, did you?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anita Raju. I'm Community Liaison in Eastern Region. I had a similar situation as Artie, dealing with geohazards. So geohazards are considered geological conditions capable of causing damage or loss to property or life. Example, landslides, sinkholes, soil erosion caused by wind, ice, snow, plants, water. I received an inquiry from the public about a sinkhole near a pipeline, and they actually attached pictures with it, which did help. I did some preliminary research to identify the pipeline operator and jurisdiction. It did fall under PHMSA jurisdiction. I contacted the operator to let them know if they were not aware that there's sinkholes near the pipeline and requested additional information. Just as Dave had mentioned earlier, we do communicate with the region, so they are aware of certain situations. So I did provide the region with information about the situation, and in this circumstance, the region decided to have an inspector go on site. And also, as already mentioned, it gives a different perspective. Although it was appreciative with the pictures being sent to us, going on site can give a better view and an understanding of the concerns. I updated the Inquirer as appropriate with information. The operator did conduct an evaluation and provided reports to show that there was no immediate threats. The sinkholes were feet away from the actual pipeline, no pipeline exposure. The operator continues to monitor the situation. And also, PHMSA, like already had mentioned, we don't have authority to request an operator to fill in a sinkhole or remediate land conditions. And also, PHMSA doesn't have authority over easement agreements, which the easement agreement could stipulate the terms and conditions between the landowner and pipeline operator. However, PHMSA has issued advisory bulletins as recent as June 2022 about, I know I lost my train of thought, to remind operators of gas, liquid, and supercritical carbon dioxide pipeline facilities of the potential danger, or not danger, damage to pipeline facility caused by earth movement from both landslides and subsidence and variable steep and rugged terrain, and for varied geological conditions and things to consider, and also the reporting requirements such as the safety-related condition, which already had mentioned. We do have regulatory regulations like the patrols, surveillance, continuing surveillance program for the operators to ensure that the pipeline is being operated safely and maintained appropriately.
Thanks, Nita. Next slide. So just information on each one of our names, who's in what region, also the state. So the contact information, we just say, go to the PHMSA website, do the search on community liaisons, will pop up, email, phone will be on that list. So I thought to include that here. Next slide. And then just some public resources, links that we're typically using. Next slide. And look at that, we joined the 21st century. Yeah, we're doing the Twitter. You go on there and do PHMSA, the YouTube. We have some PHMSA videos out there, and then also LinkedIn. So yeah, you guys want to join the LinkedIn, get the likes out there and everything. Do that. So I wanted to leave 10 minutes for questions. And we're willing to answer, we'll try and answer a question. If we don't know the answer, we'll get back to you. So yes.
Mike, please.
Just
Mike for the people
sure.
online.
I'm just curious, how do people know to contact PHMSA, and why are they contacting you rather than the pipeline operator directly?
It could be a number of ways, right? So it could be they've tried to contact the pipeline operator and they didn't get the right answer or what they're looking for. Another one is they don't they would rather talk to maybe a public official first to get their opinion before they go to the pipeline operator. But either way, it's if we can get them both talking, and usually when we get them both talking or we talk, pipeline operators want to be a good neighbor. It comes down to that, right? So if it's to fix a fence or it's to, maybe move a pipeline marker that's in their way of mowing or things like that, those simple things, it goes a long way, right? It's not worth the battle. It's not worth the battle to say, oh, well, that's not regulatory requirement. So, it comes in many ways. Through our website, it comes in through us. It could be an email, but each one of them is a corner case. Front.
Oh, yeah, either way. Okay. Yes, I've got two questions. Try to be quick about it. So NTSB talked about earlier the issue, and I think it was dredger had hit a pipeline, and some of the reports they had were like, oh, it was 30 feet from the shore, 600 feet, and like clearly no one knew the actual distance of this pipeline from where they were. And so you mentioned how some landowners are aware that those pipelines exist, but it makes me think that with hundreds of thousands of miles of pipeline, most people still don't know that they have a 40, 50-year-old pipeline around there. So I'm curious, one, how does PHMSA try to address that and make sure people are aware of these 40, 50, 60-year-old pipelines that they may have not paid attention to at all and never heard about when they moved in? And then two, when it comes to the advisory in June or May of this year, obviously it rains a lot of places, not just in Mississippi and causing the issue with the Satarsha pipeline, but how is PHMSA going to move forward to assure the decrease in likelihood of these negative impacts on pipelines, knowing that climate change is enhancing the ridiculousness of some of these storms?
So why don't I address that first question about the location of pipelines and make sure everybody know that. So we do have a national pipeline mapping system up there. And then we also have other requirements, right? So we have a pipeline marker requirement that the pipeline operator has to put above that pipeline with information on how to contact that pipeline operator is another one. Also, before anyone, right, puts a shovel in the ground or moves dirt or grades or anything like that, they call 811, right? And that service is free to anybody that calls. Get out there, they mark where those lines are. Now, the other one, though, on the first one I mentioned, the abandoned pipelines that was abandoned, let's say 40, 50 years ago, that's a challenge, right? And that's an area where a lot of utilities are running. They're getting better at it. We're trying to find out what is the best practices out there. On the advisory bulletin, this was you referring to Corpus Christi dredging incident?
Well, the geohazard and the Satarsha incident causing the pipeline abandonment.
Yeah, so there's a number of things there, right? It can be, typically we go back to the integrity management program and the threats, right, that are out there, right? Does the operator know that there's threats, that there's, that there's some geohazards out there that, hey, these things have slumped off in the past, right? This is something they're monitoring. So we go back to those rules and we make sure that we put that advisory bulletin out there. We repeat it every time we do outreach, right? There's a new advisory bulletin. It could be flooding up in the Pacific Northwest, or it could be, hurricanes down in the southeast. So we try and get that information out there as soon as possible.
Maria Dunn, P66 also. I was surprised a little bit by the order of items on your top 10 list of landowner concerns. And from a company perspective, I would say safety is paramount to us, that we focus a lot on because of the benefits that it can have for operating excellence and mechanical integrity and other things. Can you help us, though, with those top 3 or 4 for us to think about and take back to our peers within our companies, how to bridge that concept that incidents and accidents from a landowner's perspective was number 10, and yet that may be number 1 from perhaps an operator perspective? And anything from your experiences that you think can help us understand what you're hearing so that we can bridge that gap internally?
If you could go back to slide 7, 1 minute, we got 1 minute. Remember, this will be out there on the website. So I'll go from number 6. So emergency planning and oil spill. A lot of people want to know, hey, can I get invited to an oil spill drill like that they're mandated to do for the hazardous liquid pipelines, the oil pipelines out there. Jurisdictional issues. This is one of those, hey, who regulates it? Is it gathering? Is it flow lines, production lines? Or is it, in between offshore platforms? So we can get a lot of those questions, or is it regulated or not? Incident and accidents. And the reason why that's down there is because when a large incident happens, it's on the media, right? So it's out there. It's not really a public inquiry that we're already getting. Usually you're getting more information from the news, right, than we can give you at that time. But that's why it's low in terms of the calls that we receive in each region, and that's how we rank it. So one more.
I live in a rural area. We have like gas gathering lines kind of going through the back of the ranch and everything. And we're also in Texas. We're probably going to get like a lot of CO2 pipelines in the near future. I'm concerned about the CO2 pipelines and also just the fact that most, like the general public, like really doesn't know about potential risks from these pipelines. Would it be within the purview of your office to do some like widespread public education campaigns and training for emergency responders on CO2 potential damage incidents and how to react when those do happen and prevent?
Yeah, so I think that's a great idea. I know we're running out of time, but it's so right now if they build a CO2 pipeline and it meets that criteria, right? It's in the liquid form, supercritical. They have to follow the same regulations as a crude oil or petroleum products line, right? They have to do their emergency planning, they have to do their education, public awareness, right, with landowners and anyone in that affected area. But in terms of going out there and doing that additional outreach, and then as our regulations catch up with this new CO2 growth, that's a great idea, and I think we need to promote that.
As a landowner who has gathering land on their ranch, I've never had any training from the company.
Yeah. All these are corner cases. It could be a non-regulated gathering line, right? That's not regulated by PHMSA at that time. So, but yeah, I'll give you my card. Okay. Thank you, everyone.
What happened to my?
You got on one of our lists.
I want to share with you with our other panelists and Linda. I don't know if y'all have met Lisa, Linda, Ray.
Hello. Hello. Nice to meet you too.
So Ray's from Satartia, Mississippi. Wow. Lisa is in North Carolina, and you're based in DC, right? Well, my job's in DC. I live in Atlanta. Atlanta. Okay. So we're from all over. And then Dr. Reyes is going to be our other panelist. And hi, I'm Erin. It's so nice to meet you in person. Perfect. This is our panel, so I was just introducing everyone. Okay. Yeah, I don't have any slides or anything. I really just would rather us have, as much of a flowing conversation as possible. So if you guys had a chance to look at what I emailed, that's great. If not, no worries. I know I sent it out very late at night. But I'm just going to do an intro and talk a little bit about some, analyses that I've looked at that just introduce some data about, vulnerable communities' proximity to pipelines. And then I'll just turn it over to questions and we can just start talking about, our experiences and everything. So, I'll try to tee up certain things that, like, I've talked to each of you about one-on-one that y'all have, experienced or worked on. But if there's anything that, like, I'm not asking that you want to say, please just, chime in anytime. And I think we'll probably try to go for like 30 or 35 minutes and then turn it to Q&A. Because I felt like in some of the other panels, they didn't leave enough time for questions. So I want to kind of make sure, like, we give people a chance to ask questions too.
So, Erin, my story, that story.
Yes.
Coming out of that, we're going to have a database that's going to be made available to all the public.
Oh, great. Well, I think you'll talk about that. Yeah, that would be excellent.
That's what I want to, because we are taking some very specific actions as a result of that. And so I want to have an opportunity about going forward.
Yeah.
Because I think that's a big thing. We really want to roll it out before this meeting.
You can give us a sneak preview. Yeah. That'll be good. Yeah, that sounds great.
And how do you pronounce your name? DeBray?
It's DeBray, but my name is DeEmeris DeBray.
Emeris.
DeEmeris. Yes, but DeBray is my middle name. So.
Okay. So which you prefer to call by?
DeBray.
DeBray. Okay. I'm Linda.
Okay, Linda.
And
Maria.
Maria, can we call you Maria? Yeah. We have to call you
Okay, I was
Dr.
gonna
Maria?
ask, you want to be Dr. Reyes or Maria? Okay.
And I'm Lisa. And you're Lisa. Okay, great.
Graham?
We need to call her Dr. Aaron.
Absolutely not. No one has ever called me. Oh, that's funny. But yeah, it should be a good discussion. I'm trying to think if there's anything else for advanced CAP, but I don't think so. I know I didn't do a call with everyone like before today, but I know I've talked to each of you one-on-one and like kind of chatted about the geographies where you're living and working, or for you, Linda, it's everywhere. And I feel like everyone has really, interesting, like parallel, but also very different experiences with oil and gas infrastructure and pipelines. So yeah, I think it'll be good to just kind of share and talk about stuff. And I do, the way I structured the questions is like, we'll start by sort of talking about what are the impacts, like what are people dealing with, what do people experience, and then hopefully talk, kind of towards the end about like what can we do about it, how can we make it better. So maybe, Linda, we should tee up your story towards the end so you can talk about the, the database that's coming out, which might be a good,
However you want to do it. I mean, it has to do with the oversight, the issues with oversight, the issues with, I want to repeat it. I'm going to surprise you. I do tend to get emotional. So I'm trying very hard not to get emotional.
You can do whatever you want.
It's okay. Yes. It's okay to be emotional.
This is the time and the place.
Yeah. Cool. That's all I got. Yeah.
Okay.
I think we have 5 minutes. Does this start at 3:40?
3:40.
Okay, so technically we start in 1 minute. I guess we can get settled, but I might wait for these people to get settled too a little bit.
So 1 minute, you said?
That's what the clock says, but I think I'll probably start in like 2 to 3 minutes. Just my other question was, I can introduce everybody. Like I can introduce all of you. I have your bios, or I can, go down the line and let you introduce yourself. Do y'all have a preference, or? Okay, I'll do a quick one, and then if I miss anything,
You're not that great.
I'm gonna be like I'm not gonna. I'm gonna do
Just say field operation.
I won't read you.
Yeah. You know how they are, they're long.
I know, they're so
They
long.
follow them.
Yeah, that sounds good. I will not scooch over.
Can I sit here? Since I don't really have that many notes, it's just that I can't find them.
That's how
This will be,
Yeah, I can.
this will be organic. This will be an organic. Yes. It'll be good.
Yes. Grab some water, and there's more candles.
Let's see. I'm not supposed to be wearing my coat all day, but I'm freezing. Yeah, well, I saw the thermometer at 68, which I find cold when it's cold out. I was going to take a walk. I'm like, no, not today. I'll wait till too windy. It's really cold. I did not dress appropriately for this trip. Well, I thought it was, I did see it was going to be chilly, but I didn't know it was going to be so cold.
Okay, everyone, we're going to get started. If you could take your seats.
This one over here. So you and I've got it. I didn't know about that disaster until earlier today, and I saw it, and I was like, "Oh my God, I can't believe anybody survived it."
Yes, ma'am.
Because I joined. I joined
Very blessed. Very
space. Yes. Yeah, I want to see your database too.
How's everybody doing? Okay, I feel like we're approaching quiet, which means I'm just going to go ahead and start talking and get us started. Thanks everyone for joining this
panel discussion today. We're talking about the effects of pipelines on vulnerable communities. I'm Erin Murphy, and I'm a senior attorney with Environmental Defense Fund on our Energy Markets and Utility Regulation team. I'm going to do a quick rundown of our panelists, and then I'm going to provide a little bit of background information based on some sort of research and analyses on this topic before turning it over to a discussion with the panel. And there are no slides at all, so we're just having a conversation here today. So our panelists, if I can go in what I think is alphabetical order, I'll start with Debray Burns, who I think you heard from the reporter earlier today about the Satartia incident. Debray is a survivor of that CO2 pipeline break in Satartia, Mississippi. And we're thankful to him and to all the panelists for joining us today. Linda Dougherty is the Deputy Associate Administrator for Pipeline Safety, Field Operations at Department of Transportation, PHMSA. And at her request, I will not be reading the full paragraph of her bio, so I'll keep it succinct for everyone. Dr. Maria Reyes is the Deputy Director of Commission Shift, which is a statewide nonprofit in Texas working on reforming the Railroad Commission. And Lisa Sorg is an award-winning environmental investigative reporter with North Carolina Policy Watch, or NC Policy Watch, from North Carolina. So thanks to everyone for being here with us. And yeah, we're talking about the effects of pipelines on vulnerable communities. And I wanted to start with just sort of information as a baseline, which is that we know that research, data, and lived experiences demonstrate that pipeline infrastructure in the United States can disproportionately burden vulnerable communities. And that includes lower income and minority communities. And today we're talking about that problem and also looking to identify solutions and pathways for improvement. I want to acknowledge that my professional focus and sort of background is on natural gas pipelines, but we are going to be talking more broadly, and all pipelines, have effects and are located in communities that can have negative impacts for folks. So we're going to cover everyone, but some of this data I'm sharing at the start is a little more gas pipeline focused because that's where my thinking and experience comes from. So I wanted to share a 2021 peer-reviewed analysis from some researchers at North Carolina State found that the existing network of natural gas gathering and transmission lines in the US is concentrated more heavily in counties where people experience higher levels of social vulnerability. And that social vulnerability metric is an integrated measure of a community's capacity to prepare for, deal with, and recover from pollution and other hazards. And it takes into account demographic details such as racial composition and age distribution, as well as other socioeconomic information. And so that analysis looked at the social vulnerability index on a county level, and again found that gathering and transmission lines tend to be more heavily concentrated in counties with higher social vulnerability. And thinking about what are the impacts of pipelines, you have easements that put practical limitations on what you can do and how you can use land. You have the direct safety impacts of increased risk or fear of leaks, rupture, and explosions. And then there's research indicating that safety and other concerns about pipelines can erode the sense of belonging felt by communities, particularly for rural communities. And that research shared some conclusions and recommendations, including the need to consider cumulative impacts when thinking about infrastructure. So, if you're citing new infrastructure and you think about it sort of in isolation, that can miss the accumulation of other existing energy infrastructure and pipelines in a location. And as that starts to build up, again, that's when you start to see those real sort of overburdening of the communities where the infrastructure is located. Researchers have also identified that there's a research gap regarding the socioeconomic and health impacts associated with midstream energy infrastructure, and emphasize the difficulty in assessing risks due to confidentiality and security concerns around making some of that data public, which of course then makes it hard to do some of the analyses that help us understand these impacts. The other study I wanted to call out is a 2022 peer-reviewed study that looked at gas pipeline leak locations on distribution systems. And I think we have one of the authors of this paper in the audience, Jovan Fisher at Colorado State. Hi, Joe. This research found that neighborhoods with more people of color and lower household income tended to have more gas leaks. So the average leak density, which is the number of leaks per mile on a pipeline, increased by 37% for those populations compared to predominantly white neighborhoods. And leak density also increased slightly in neighborhoods with older housing infrastructure, which can be another indicator of wealth in some instances. So we know that those gas leaks on distribution lines, much like the gathering and transmission lines, can pose safety threats, can also make people sort of feel nervous in their community if they know that there's leaks on pipelines, and can also harm vegetation, which can be a big issue in urban areas where tree cover is really important for mitigating heat and for also providing aesthetics. So thinking about that sort of chunk of data that I just threw at everyone, I think there's a lot more information out there, right? But we know that as a baseline, pipelines tend to be located in places where they can have more of an impact on vulnerable communities. And then it's not just about where the pipeline is, but also what it does while it's there, right? And what happens. And so there's a lot of sort of implications from having a pipeline in your community beyond just the construction of it. So I want to turn it over to the panel and just start by talking about what is it like for members of a community to live near a pipeline. And in particular, and Lisa, I know this is something that we chatted about a little bit at one point, and Debray, I want to hear your perspective on this as well. Do people know a pipeline is in their community unless and until there's a major incident or something goes wrong?
Most people don't. Most people don't, especially the people that are not, like 5 miles from it. You've seen people like we ride up the road and you see people working. What y'all got going on? We got a pipe. We're putting a pipeline through. So, but if people don't ask, they wouldn't know.
In the case of the Colonial Pipeline, which was a gasoline pipeline, they had a spill of 2 million gallons on August 14th, 2020 in Huntersville, which is a suburb of Charlotte. And people did not know that the pipeline was there. The leak occurred in a nature preserve, and it was discovered by 2 teenagers riding ATVs and saw, it was kind of like the Beverly Hillbillies, if you've ever seen that, where they're, Texas tea, but instead of oil, it was gasoline. And so people had no idea until these kids found it.
Erin, do you mind?
No, go ahead.
So one thing we also found is, the general public often does not know something that's not in their immediate vicinity. You may not even know what those line markers are. But what is also significant is often emergency responders don't know what's going through their community. And we saw that in the case of San Bruno. And there's been a lot of effort to try to make sure people are aware. But the question is, how do you create awareness? How, when it's not a top priority, it's like, what do we not know? And how do we know to pay attention to what we don't know? And so it's a constant battle, both with the public and with emergency responders, because when something bad happens, who do you want to know what's there and what's going on, right? You want your emergency responders to say, I know what that is, I'm going to address it. So, and also the public, the public has to know if something goes wrong, if the worst happens, what does the community do? Do they know the correct action to take to protect themselves, right?
Thanks for that. And maybe let's talk a little about how does a community react and how does their perception change to pipeline infrastructure, in and around their community when there is a safety or another sort of incident that folks become aware of. What does that do for sort of the relationship? Can there be an erosion of trust there?
No, I don't trust them at all. I can't trust them at all. I mean, I've listened to people talking about safety and what they're trying to do to prevent what happened in Satasha, but you really can't. There's no way. I mean, like, we live in the pipeline that runs down through Satasha. We live in hills, and it's always, the ground is always shifting, always. And environmental people should know about this. If it rains, some's going to fall, some's going to hit. And that's exactly what happened in Satasha. And we were unaware. We had no way of knowing what was going to happen. I was just driving down the road, coming back from a nice day of fishing, didn't know anything until boom, I watched it, I saw it, and I had seconds to call my mother and tell her, Mama, this pipeline blew up. We're on our way to come get y'all. And as I turned down the road, as my cousin turned down the road, the car just shut off. We had no time. No time. So no, I can't trust that. I moved out of Satartia since then. So.
And did you know it was a CO2 pipeline?
I didn't know what was, I knew it was a pipeline, but I didn't know what was going through it. And a lot of people try to tell us, well, CO2, it doesn't hurt you. But I tell you what, put a plastic bag over your head for a couple of hours and take it off and tell me how you feel. And so, I am very untrustworthy of that.
And I wonder, Maria, if you want to speak to in Texas, there's a lot of pipeline infrastructure in Texas where your organization is doing work. What is sort of community perception like there?
I feel like I am in NPR, right? I've arrived. So Texas is a very convoluted state, but I was in the presence of a lot of people for the past 2 days and today that have suffered the consequences even outside of Texas. And, that's bringing a whole new perspective to the issue. But in Texas, we do have a big beast. Texas has over 488,000 miles of pipes, and about 200,000 of that is unregulated. And then on top of that, there are types of pipes, small pipes, pipes that have not been recorded, right, that add to the list. And so because of that, we have explosions that are not incidents. So the definition of incidents becomes very significant. And if you've attended, some of the conversations today, I'm glad someone else has also been talking about this idea. How do we define an incident? Little kids have died in Texas. And because it was a pipe that was 100, feet from a household, no one became responsible for that, right? And so it is a consequence of the poor. It is a consequence and a cost that is being carried by people that do not speak Spanish because it tends to concentrate on those areas. And so we do have to start thinking in terms of who are we sacrificing for this development, especially in the state of Texas. And so it is convoluted, and I'm one of the blessed that haven't experienced any of these consequences, but I have to let you know that I take your stories with me, and they inspire me. They inspire me to continue fighting. So
one thing that's also important, I think, is after the accident, after the spill or the leak or whatever, there's been a real erosion of trust, at least in Huntersville, in that the narrative changed. And of course, things can be a fluid situation, but even after it had settled down, first it was, Colonial had, detected a pressure drop at their Alpharetta facility. Then no, the ATV kids found it, and then they reported it in. So there was already a narrative switch, and even state lawmakers were very concerned about that. And then the town hosted a meeting it was during COVID, so it was online, but they hosted a meeting with Colonial, and it was very self-congratulatory, like, wow, we got this taken care of, we're great. And that fooled no one. One of the quotes at the time from Colonial was, the majority of the product was recovered as it was released. At that point, it was 63,000 gallons. It is now 2 million. It's clearly that the majority of the product was not recovered as it was released. So I think it's very important that afterward that there's got to be some kind of trust built. And that's only comes through honesty. I mean, granted, you don't know exactly how many barrels or gallons, but to say the majority of it had been recovered when you really don't even know what the end result is, that's no way to build trust.
Yeah, I appreciate you raising that because I think it's so important. And I want to, I feel like we're talking some about trust between the community and the operator of a pipeline. But I want to also maybe talk a little bit about the role of regulators there, because I think even when there's not an incident, but in particular when something happens for a community, they're, hearing Debray share the total lack of trust that you feel in the operator. I think there's a real importance for the regulator to be for the community to be able to feel like there's sort of someone stepping in and taking charge and holding folks accountable. And I feel like I'm saying all of this, so I need to give Linda a chance to maybe speak to that. But I also want to hear from everyone about sort of what do you view as that relationship, and like maybe what do you want to see out of a regulator in a community, right, when something happens.
So what do you want me to tell my story?
Go right ahead.
So that was a setup. I asked her if I could share a story, something that happened to me over the last year. Actually, when the Biden administration came in, they sent, the secretary sent down a message and said, we want everybody to think about how we can address equity issues. How can we do better? How can we do better on climate change? Can we do better on energy transformation? And one of the issues that came was equity. And my response was, well, pipelines are equitable, right? Right? Everybody that needs natural gas gets them, right? And so I was kind of dismissive of our role in this area. And we had two, and I'll admit they were younger, more innovative thinkers that said, hey, we want to tackle this. We want to look at this issue. And they went off and did their study, and they came back and they presented information that floored me. And have you ever been in a situation where your bias hit you in the face hard? So they presented information that showed very similar, and it must have been occurring at the same time as the study you mentioned, that showed that a 5-year-old growing up in a socially disadvantaged area was more likely to experience a pipeline incident than a 5-year-old growing up in an affluent area. Okay, I started as a pipeline safety inspector, right? 30 years ago, I was out inspecting pipelines. And I looked at the data and I said, that can't be right. Well, I was wrong. I was very wrong. So proceed forward. I started having discussions with people. Why would that be? Because you have a defensive mechanism, right? My job has been a safety regulator for all people for 30 years. Why is there this discrepancy? So, it's older infrastructure, right? Older cities, right? You have disadvantaged areas where they tend to be in urban areas, in the older parts of town. What have you got in the older parts of town? You got older infrastructure, right? Oh, well, that's what's going on, right? Next part. I'm thinking back, and this is self-disclosure. I'm thinking back when I was a young inspector, and I was out doing a pipeline inspection. And it was Thursday afternoon. I don't remember the exact details, but it was at the end of my inspection. And part of what we do is we select random locations. I told you I was going to get emotional. I'm already shaking. We select random locations to go out and do field visits, right? We've already checked procedures. We've checked records. We're going to pick random locations. It's Thursday night or Friday morning, and I'm looking at the locations, and I say, I want to go here, here, and here. And the company says, okay, well, we're going to have to get a police escort for this area. And I'm like, oh, man, I've got a flight. I'll get it next time. I didn't go back. How many regulators, safety inspectors don't go back because it's too hard or it's too scary? Those vulnerable communities, again, think of the 5-year-old. Okay, so then it's almost like the universe ordained this. I go to a meeting and I'm talking to a number of industry representatives. And I'm telling them this story. I say, I can't believe this data. I can't believe what this says. And they're like, yeah, we know. It's true. What do you mean it's true? And I'm thinking, I can't believe you as industry are telling me this, a regulator. And I had one lady raise her hand and she said, yeah, my maintenance crews are always saying, why do we always go spend more time and more money in these affluent areas and not in the disadvantaged areas? Next week, the very next week, I'm speaking to a group of state pipeline safety inspectors like me, but at the state level. I'm telling this story. Can you believe this? And around the room, the state inspector said, yeah, we know. Getting those police escorts are very difficult. So you want to tell me, it makes me mad, it makes me furious. So when you have this knowledge, you must act on it. Ethical, morally, you must do something. I will say, to the credit of every group I have spoken to about this, they have acted. I'm going to tell you what, am I spending too much time? Can I tell you? I will tell you, when I spoke to industry, after I spoke to them, they called the next week and said, we need to see that data, we want to talk. And they're taking action. I've talked to industry, I said, you need to compare your data. Now let me tell you where this data comes from, because you are going to have access to it. We're making it publicly available. We are taking the data. It basically took the Center of Disease Control Socially Vulnerable Areas. I don't know if you guys have heard of it. I call it SVI. And it compares those socially vulnerable areas based on census tracts and pipeline incidents. Where do pipeline incidents occur relative to these census areas? We've created an interactive map. So you can go look. You will be rolling that out hopefully before the end of the year. Blaine Keener, who you may have heard, he's actually speaking in the other room. It's his team that's developing this. And you're going to be able to go out and look at a pipeline and look at the incidents on those pipelines and look at the communities that they're in. We've told companies, you need to check where your pipelines are and your incident history and your safety condition history in these areas. Okay, that's what industry's doing. I spoke with the NTSB. You heard Jennifer Hamady. Both PHMSA and NTSB are going to take these issues into consideration when we make determinations of launching. Chris Rule right there is running the program for looking at this when he launches, when he determines to launch for PHMSA. Okay. Next, I want you to know, and I'm about done. Not only are we rolling out this database, there's a gentleman back there, Bill Rush. Bill, put your hand up. Bill Rush is in charge of our community liaisons. We may have some in here. They're developing a program to do specific outreach in socially vulnerable areas because of just what we're talking about here. How many people don't know? We've also modified our inspections because I do not want another inspector saying, I don't want to spend time and wait to go into this area because it's a scary place to go. Our inspectors are going to be asked to schedule inspections deliberately in socially vulnerable areas. We're going to do it deliberately and with intention because of what happened in Sartasha, what happens in other places around the country. People don't know, and they have a right to know, and we're going to do our darndest to make sure that those safety protections, that a 5-year-old in a disadvantaged area has the exact same or even better safety protections as a 5-year-old growing up in an affluent area.
Thanks for sharing that. I think that we'll get to questions in a little bit. You know, to me, such an essential part of this is that transparency leads to accountability. You can't have accountability without transparency. You can't know if there's inequity without having information and looking at it and considering these issues. And so it's you know, really great to hear about some of those steps. And I want to sort of draw this forward and talk about, you know, what does that mean for communities and what can communities themselves do and what do they experience? And Maria, I don't know, maybe if you want to talk a little bit about the engagement that your organization had on the recommended practice, because I think that, and I know that was discussed earlier, but sort of how the community itself can be part of some of these decision-making processes.
I was a professor in higher education teaching government, and I was driven by empowering the masses by practicing democracy. And I joined Commission Shift in April, and one of the first assignments I got was to make comments on the recommended practices, right? And it was such a great experience. I can't emphasize that enough. The way that they organized it, the way that I got results back telling me which changes were considered and which ones were not. Of course, there were a lot of commas accepted, right? But there were issues that were not addressed. And now we're going to have a new period of comments. However, and this is where the but comes in, as enthusiastic as I am with the changing paradigm that people are promoting with this new approach, civic engagement is not a new idea. And it isn't in the sense of democracy or in the sense of the power of the people. Engagement has been present for a long time. And when it comes to Texas, a state that is captive by the agency and where a lot of pipes, because they are intrastate, don't actually fall under the regulation of PHMSA, and where the regulation says follow standards of the API or standards can set by the director of the Railroad Commission, we have a problem. And we have a big problem because if it's happening in Texas, I'm pretty sure it's happening in other states. So I applaud the spirit because it was inspiring to come into a community of safety. Your language of safety was even very much prominent in the Railroad Commission Regulatory Conference. PHMSA and the Pipeline Safety Trust, your culture is different. So I'm going to tell you, I applaud you and I hope you continue. But we need to do a lot more in the state of Texas, and I'm pretty sure in other states with these standards of engagement. Consider this, and I know that I don't want you to think in terms of I'm biting the hand that's feeding me, but we need more people of color in these panels. Okay? So please, every time you have a podcast, consider inviting someone of color. And now you have tribes that you can, reach out. You have people in Louisiana who are suffering big consequences. Invite them, because a lot of these panels still look very much the same. Thank you.
Bray, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your experience after the incident happened, and in particular, sort of experiences you had with the company and with the regulator, good or bad.
Changed my, excuse me. It changed my life. I mean, I haven't worked since it happened. I was an inspector at a lumber mill and making pretty decent money, supporting my family, like every decent man does, And it's been hard for me because when I had to stop working, I couldn't take care of my daughters like I wanted to. They had to move away to go up there with their mom. They were with me, but they had to go stay with their mom because I was incapable of supporting them. And I'm incapable of supporting myself. I'm suffering from short-term memory loss. Let's say I can be boiling some hot dogs on the stove and forget just like that. I've almost burnt the house down on a couple of occasions. I left something on the stove and my girlfriend, luckily she got up and it was just full of smoke, and accidentally she got burned. And I don't even use the stove anymore. I have to use the microwave or something that beeps to let me know that, okay, you had something on the stove. And back to my job, you know, we have to work at a fast pace. I used to jog 3 to 5 miles every day after I get off work. Now I can't even make it a half of a quarter of a mile without having to use this. I do have asthma, but I had it regulated. I would get sick like when the months change, you know, seasons change, whatever, you know, asthmatics do. But now I have to use this every day. This is my crutch. I have to have it. You know, there's no way around it. If I don't have this, I lose my breath, I lose consciousness. It's hard waking up at the middle of the night and you can't breathe. I mean, it's just uncanny. It messed with me physically, emotionally, personally, financially. And you know, when I lost my job, I lost my insurance. So, you know, you can't go to the doctor, you know what I'm saying? Checking on my back, my lungs and all that. It hurts. And, you know, that's the only support that I have. And, you know, I like taking care of her, but now she's taking care of me, and that's been happening since 2020. So you're talking about you get emotional. Oh my goodness. But you know, it's been a lot for me, my brother, and my cousin. You know, my cousin was a truck driver. And by us not being able to concentrate like that, he can't get on the road anymore. So, you know, it's just a lot to deal with here. And so I tell anybody, you know, I hope you guys do get everything together and get it safe to where if you're gonna run them. But if you're not gonna do it, just don't do it. I mean, that's just the way I feel about it. Because I don't want anybody to have to go through what I'm going through right now. And that's pretty much all I have to say.
Thanks for sharing that. Lisa, I'm thinking about the colonial spill that you were talking about and the fact that more information has sort of come out and that the spill had continued to expand. And I just wonder if you could talk more about, you know, what the information sharing dynamic was like and how the community reacted to that.
Sure. The state regulators and Colonial had a public-facing website that did list some information, although, as I said, there were some trust issues. The groundwater plume is moving gradually. There have been no drinking water wells affected with gasoline at this point. However, Colonial did buy out 3 properties. The remediation is happening in people's backyard. Several people told me, well, my neighbor was bought out and my neighbor was put on public water, but I'm right on the line. Am I next? People looking out, literally, I stood with a man who looked out his backyard and there is an air monitor right there. And so he does not feel very confident in his safety and his health. And also I would say for those regulators, when you put data out there and you're, you know, measuring benzene in the air or whatever, people put it in, you don't have to dumb it down, but put it in language people can understand. They don't understand milligrams per liter or microgram, you know, that kind of scientific data means nothing to average folks. If you're not in the world of air pollution or water pollution, you don't know what any of that means. You don't know what the standard is. So it's very important to help people make sense of the information that you're giving them, because a lot of folks in this community were like, well, what does this mean at this level? Is it safe or not? And I would also say that as an aside, one of the ongoing questions that has led to trust is that when you put out a fire or if there's a risk of ignition, the firefighting foam that is used to put these flames out or to keep it from igniting often contain harmful chemicals. They're called PFAS, they're called fluorinated compounds. I won't go down that rabbit hole, but they're bad, really bad, even in like small parts per trillion. And so that there has been a lot of discussion between Colonial and the state regulators because they found PFAS in mixed product, which is water and the F500 foam, and that foam was not supposed to have PFAS in it. And somehow it appeared. So again, people are concerned about that run off into their drinking water wells or the surface water. So long way of saying this is going to be this was the 32nd spill in North Carolina by Colonial. So this, and there's still houses that have been bought out and you know, cleanups decades old. This will be going on for at least another, I would say, 10 years. And so people are going to have to live with that and the decline of their property values as well.
And can I add just one note? So thank you. Very, very good information. One thing that I think a lot of people don't know is when a bad thing happens, there isn't a federal agency right now that has responsibility for going out and monitoring health impacts. This is something that Bill Karam, I don't know if he's in here. No, Carl Weimer. Carl Weimer, sorry, Bill. Carl Weimer had brought up. He said, PHMSA, why aren't you out there monitoring health effects? It's totally outside of our area of expertise. We don't have that expertise. And then we started looking at it. So back when the Marshall, Michigan spill happened years ago, the question was who was out there monitoring the BTX in the air and the impact on the people? And the question was who does that? And it turned out to be it was local officials. And the question was you had all these federal agencies, swarms of federal agencies, but none of us have authority or in many cases expertise to do that type of monitoring. So there maybe is a gap there, especially when you're talking about vulnerable communities. Maybe, and I don't know, I want to speak for Satoshi because I love Mississippi, but I think Satoshi is kind of a small community, right?
It is.
Yeah. So would the local officials have had the equipment to measure? I don't know. They didn't. So something to think about when we think about vulnerable communities, whether it be in urban areas, you might have, big fire departments or whatever. What about the small communities? What about the rural areas?
And to add in on what she's talking about, it's a Tarsha, like correspondence, where we were, it's just a little dirt road right there. Everybody, they checked the town of Satoshi. Like Dan said, most people self-evacuated. There was a few still there that they had to get out. And the correspondents were there. And if it wasn't for Jerry Briggs and Terry Gans, they had to come from Vicksburg to Satoshi. After they evacuated Satoshi, they was like, is there anywhere else that we need to go? Because we need to get out of here. And one correspondent said, look, we checked everything, let's go. And Terry Gans said, there's a little old road right behind the post office. If y'all could ride down there, because they were about to leave. And Jerry Briggs said, well, we came to do a job. Let's go down here and check them out. And they found me and my brother and my cousin unconscious in the car, foaming out the mouth. And the correspondent said, first time when he looked at us, he said immediately he thought they're dead. They had to bust the windows out of the car, put the car in park, bust the windows out the car to get us out. They were going to try to take us out one by one. And Jerry Briggs said, no, we're going to have to load all of them up on this ATV. And you think about 3 grown men on an ATV, and then they threw their tanks, everything on top of us. The way he described it, we had to load them up like dead deer. And the ATV was sputtering, and it took him about 15 minutes to get us out of there. But he told me himself, I got a chance to thank them, hug them, talk to them. And he said, if we got there about 5 minutes later, you probably wouldn't be sitting here beside me. And they're talking about building trust. It blew up on us, and then a few months later, it ruptured again. But at this point, nobody was injured. So, it's hard to build trust when stuff like this happens. The impact is great. And like a little old town like Satoshi, we don't have a lot of, people don't come talk to us. We don't pretty much, get out and be, expressing ourselves. And I just want to say thank y'all for giving me the opportunity to tell y'all what happened to us. That's all.
Thanks for sharing that. We have 15 minutes and I want to make sure we take questions, but I also want to make sure we talk at least a little bit about solutions and positive steps that we can take forward. So I kind of just want to open it up before we go to questions and ask, Linda, I know you shared a lot of positive steps that PHMSA is working on and moving forward on. Does anyone else want to share what you think should be done, or something that is being done to improve vulnerable communities' experiences with pipelines?
I would like to invite people to take with you the spirit of meaningful engagement. Environmental justice standards are about dignity to the human, how a human has to have the recognition of deciding for themselves what can harm them and what cannot harm them. We need to be involved in your decision making when it comes to development. Take that spirit with you. Talk to people that have been affected so you can take their stories, so that the industry can start taking into account these standards, because they are about the spirit of deciding for ourselves how to rule ourselves, how to live in nature or in accordance or in balance with our own spaces, how we have to think of survival, and how we need to move away from a total economic mind. And this is a paradigm shift. That's the paradigm shift you need to start thinking about. This is what regenerative economics is calling for. This is where we are uniting with our past in the tribal spirit. Can we see nature, water, air, our land as part of our decision-making process? Because our water is disappearing. We use it for the extraction of gas, of oil. Our air is contaminated. Our health is being affected. And we continue to talk about what? In many areas of the United States, we don't have the question of can we collaborate? It is a decision of can we even survive with more of this pipe development? And I need you to take that with you, because that is the question we're asking ourselves of surviving. I know that didn't sound positive, but I swear if you take it with you, it's going to fill you, okay?
That was awesome.
Connectivity fills us. So I'm sorry.
No, it was awesome. Thanks for that. I think we could go ahead and take some questions. I know this gentleman had his hand raised earlier. Did you still have a question, sir?
I do, yes.
Got it.
Thank you. I worked for a utility company for 30 years before retiring. I'm a consultant now. I'll share with you one where we did it the right way. And here's what I'm going to add to anybody in the room that's in a leadership decision. Make the tough decisions. Do the job. You don't have to if you don't want to, but you're going to darn well wish you had. We had a situation. I asked for the music also. But can't make this up. Okay. Well, here's what happened. When we look at, it says vulnerable communities, they don't have to necessarily be poor. The situation I'll share with you now was happened up in the Northeast in a middle class, predominantly black, but a lot of brown people, nice houses, good jobs. 3 generations they had to fight a gas leak of about maybe 300 pounds per square inch. That's about maybe 2 of you standing on a pogo stick. That's the pressure in the pipe. Now, at a certain point, there were patches all over the street. There were trees burned, cars burned out, siding burned off of houses. Then I remembered in 3 different assignments I'd been out there. Now I'm in charge of maintenance on the transmission pipe. And what we were doing was just imagine the window panes up there and all these supports being just the piping. No one will look at the entire wall there and say, let's look at everything together. We look at this piece, that's not that bad. We look at the middle piece, that's not that bad. They were all calling that a grade 3 leak. That's the lowest grade leak you have. But when you put all that together It was a tremendous hazard that was left there. So we don't have the money in the budget. I said, do we have the money to go to court? What do you think we should do? I said, we're going to spend the money. So I had the whole thing just done. But the point I'm making here is that you can't play the budget game. You've got to look at the big picture. You've got to spend this. You've got to have leaders every place making the right decision. They don't necessarily have to be black or brown or whatever. But one of the ladies was a retired teacher, and I'll leave you with this. She tugged on me when I came out. She pointed to me all the damage. And she says, Mr. Miles, we can put a man on the moon. Why can't we fix this problem? And that's the challenge I'll make to you professionals in the room. Why can't you fix it? Thank you.
Very good points.
Thank you, Mr. Burns, for sharing your story. I appreciate that. So I'm a grad student, but I'm also work for a pipeline company. And one of the things I learned this semester is obviously PHMSA, through the 1990 Oil Pollution Act, has the ability to institute settlement funds. And in the case of like BP's Deepwater Horizon, there was $20 million set aside in Louisiana for those impacted by that event. So I was just curious about Sartosha, how the company is maybe taking care of you or the other community members and your health needs specifically. And if PHMSA, I don't know a lot about this event, sorry, I haven't researched it, but if there was a settlement dollar set aside for things like this.
They had a meeting after with in town hall in Satasha, and I call it they paid pretty much everybody in Satasha. I call it hush hush money. I really do, but I didn't sign any papers. I have somebody talking for me, but as far as them reaching out to me, I haven't heard anything from them. I mean, nothing. Like I said, that's the person that's taking care of me so far. So I haven't heard anything from them. Like I said, I do have representation, but as far as them reaching out to me, I haven't heard anything since 2020. So it's still ongoing. So I don't know how long this is going to play out, but I'm here to fight. You know, I'm not going to just take it laying down. So that's pretty much all I can say about that.
I would also say that in Huntersville, the state regulators did fine a civil penalty on Colonial $4.7 million. In the state of North Carolina, that goes to the local school system. It does not go to the impacted residents. I'm not saying that schools shouldn't get, money from civil penalties, but that would have to be taken care of through private litigation. This is a middle-class community, but, they're not made of money. That's very expensive to go up against Colonial with your own litigation. PHMSA did not fine them. There was a consent order. So $4.7 million plus another 1.7 to buy out the homes. You're looking at a $6 million plus, of course, the cleanup. But frankly, $6 million to Colonial is like if you lost $3 in the dryer. I mean, it's not that much money. And the impacted residents aren't seeing any of it.
And if you want just another way for you to make a difference, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to vote. I mean, if you're thinking in terms of why PHMSA cannot do anything, or the EPA, or they don't have teeth. Why don't they have teeth? Because legislators have taken it away. Why have they taken it away? Because economic interest matter and states' rights have risen. So if you want federal authority to have teeth, you're going to have to vote the right way. And if you don't want that, then you're going to have to go back to your states and start paying attention to those elections to select the legislators that actually care about the issues you want to. Go vote.
This is Joe Von Fisher at Colorado State University. I wanted to echo Linda's finding. We are published that work finding that natural gas leaks in local distribution companies were more likely, in fact, the greatest predictor of leak frequency was % people of color. It was a better predictor than income. And even if we accounted for housing age, which might have been a correlate for the age of infrastructure, it was still the % people of color. These are the vulnerable communities you're talking about. And I wanted to echo that when we went in the field, there were places that we couldn't go. We were told we couldn't go because of safety risk. And when I've raised this with the utilities individually, we've talked to, they abhor the statement and push back and say, no, this can't be. But I completely agree with you. I mean, out of total ignorance, I have no idea how to handle that. I mean, it seems like we just have to say, you have to go there. That's part of the job. That's the deal, period. Is that it? Is that where it ends?
That absolutely is true. And so there's different levels that's to provide safety oversight, right? The primary responsibility is with that utility or pipeline operator. It is their responsibility to make sure every part of their system is maintained and it is safe, period. And it is regulators' jobs to make sure they do it. Right? So if the regulator's not going in and checking it and the company isn't doing it, who's holding them accountable? That's what was so upsetting. We had a total mismatch. People all knew there was an issue and nobody had figured out how to solve it. Now, I will say this. I don't think many people get up in the morning saying, I'm not going to do my job. Or, oh, I don't want to go in this area and take care of this safety risk. I don't think people think that way. Things happen. But when you become aware of the situation, you have to start looking for these things. This is part of my guilt, is that I wasn't looking for this. I wasn't looking for it. And when the information was presented to me, my initial response was denial. That's that bias that I talked about. So I'm dealing with that and we're taking action. So what do? We make sure we correct the things that we can correct. We aggressively go. I'm going to give you an example. You talk about how do we reach people in vulnerable areas. Not everybody speaks English. How many communication efforts? We require pipeline operators to have a public engagement. And they'll know, okay, English and Spanish. Not everybody speaks English and Spanish. Another thing, excavator damage. You guys have heard about that. Excavation damage, leading cause pipelines. Where are the excavation damage billboards? They're on highways. How many of our most vulnerable communities get out on those highways and see those billboards? Question is, we need to start rethinking about how do we reach the communities? How do we communicate? Not everybody receives information the same way. Not everybody gets on the internet every night. Not everybody gets their news from where everybody gets the news. I don't know. That everybody has a different style. Maybe your vulnerable communities communicate in different ways. You know, may I share one last thing? So we just had an all inspector meeting. We had all of our inspectors and we were talking about some of these issues and we were talking about inspectors. You're going to be asked to go out. You need to make a concerted effort to go in these areas. And if you need to plan for police escort, you need to do it. You're going to plan it out and you're going to go in these areas. And everybody's like, okay. And then a new inspector came up to me after the meeting and she said, I don't know if you got that right. I'm thinking, whoa, what do you mean? And she was a woman of color. And she said, police may not be welcome in some areas. Right. You need to work with community leaders. You need to find out from the community how to access these areas. Don't just go. I mean, I'm not being disparative towards police. Don't take it that way. What I'm saying you have to meet the community where it is. We have a responsibility. All of us, whether you're a pipeline operator in this room, you have a responsibility. If you're a regulator in this room, you have a safety responsibility. If you're a member of the public, if you're an activist, if you're a survivor, you have a role holding everybody accountable. And you're doing it by being here. How many people are not in this room? Anyway, sorry. I'm very passionate about this because it was a real hit to me. So thank you for letting me have the time.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I think we have time for one more quick question.
It is working. Yeah, I just want to acknowledge that there's been a range of different ways in which we've talked about vulnerability in historically marginalized communities. And some topics we really haven't touched on at all, which is disproportionate siting of projects, right, as a result of, distributional justice issues, procedural justice issues we've touched on a little bit in terms of whether or not people have access to decision-making spaces. A lot of what we've been talking about seems to refer to distribution systems where we're talking about the urban core, but, there's also a significant amount of vulnerable communities in rural spaces that I'm just trying to list out some of the things that we also need to attend to, but I have a specific question. And that is, as the gentleman noted, sometimes maintenance is a big part of this. And I'm wondering whether or not, Linda, this is directed to you. We're also finding in the data, PHMSA's data, whether or not maintenance is being, disproportionately applied to more well-off communities and being pushed off in poorer communities. And yes, it's an inspection issue, but it's also an investment issue in making sure that we actually maintain existing infrastructure at equal levels.
So very good question. And that is exactly one of the questions that we are engaging on our inspections. We've asked both our state and our federal inspectors. That's one of many questions, is how are you determining where you're doing maintenance? Is there a shift? Now, I'm going to be honest. I speculate. I have no information on this. But I wonder how many companies are incentivized to invest capital, replacement projects in areas where they may not see future expansion, where it's repairing. Let me give you an example. And I'm thinking of your specific example, which I think was right on. I may use an analogy. I have a car that gets me from point A to point B. And over the years, it gets dents in it and it starts rusting out. And I think, well, I'm not going to need this car probably, a whole lot longer. Am I going to pay to repair it? Am I going to nickel and dime it? Change out a tire when I need a tire? Or am I going to change out all the tires? What am I going to do? And I wonder about the mentality, the thought process of companies that are saying, you know what, people are moving out of that area. Do we want to invest $40 million in replacing that system? Even a rural community. And I may be crossing into dangerous ground here. So I think about, there's a lot of resistance to new pipelines. Sometimes it's a lot better to replace a system than to continue to put Band-Aids on it. And when there's a lot of pushback and say, we don't want you putting a new pipeline in, which I understand, there's reasons, the shift from fossil fuels, you're almost incentivizing the Band-Aid approach. And I'm sorry, when I see Band-Aid after Band-Aid after Band-Aid, just what you were talking about, I'm concerned.
I would like just to point out, my chief executive for Commission Shift is right here. And she was an author to an article that she co-partnered with. And the findings were that, yes, that maintenance is low in areas of color, in areas of people who speak Spanish. And she can talk to you more about it. But just wanted to let you know, there are some studies out there.
And I should say that's a great reminder that is the study I was talking about. So I should have given equal credit to Virginia and Joe in the audience who both worked really hard on that paper. I think thank you so much to our panelists, and thanks everyone for joining us and for the good questions. Appreciate it.
I used to live in Texas. I lived in San Antonio, and I dealt with the Railroad Commission, and oh Lord, they are.
Oh, yeah.
Just presented with this list, and some days I feel overwhelmed.
Yeah.
I don't even know which angle to take.
The thing about
Yeah,
it,
there was I did a story about, it was a black community on the Louisiana-Texas border, and the oil and gas industry, there were injection wells that had